Previous book and this book is important. It's not into the North African. It's spread as a different thing, governance, dominant political groups, language groups, trade, right? But it's not enters West Africa through trade networks, through communications between Muslims and rulers, right? Diplomatic relations, if you will. So there is no warfare to speak of for the first 500 years of documented. There's probably history before the documented history starts, but the first 500 years of documented history of Islam in West Africa, you're searching for this warfare and this mass enslavement that everybody likes to believe happened. Right? East Africa, more than the first 500 years. Muslims leave the Arabian Peninsula, they settle down, they intermarry, they're doing trade. A new people is born. The Swahili people come from that, right? But in East Africa, the Muslims remain for a long time a coastal people, right? Which is what Swahili comes from, a derivation of the Swahili. In West Africa, the Muslims are penetrating deeply. And so this becomes a much more interesting and relevant discussion because in the last 500 years, that means Muslims are going to be transported across the Atlantic Ocean, mostly and well documentedly as enslaved persons, but before the transatlantic slave trade begins, right, there is some strong suggested evidence that Muslims were sailing to the Americas and settled. So the Walking Quran asks this question about that whole Atlantic world. What were the Muslims about when it comes to this question of slavery that has actually been used to demonize Muslims, especially African Muslims, as slave raiders? Right? He documents how it was resistance to the slave trade in West Africa that produces much of the landscape that we have in contemporary West Africa. There were some collaborators, there always are some collaborators, right? But some extremely important roots for just understanding our Muslim landscape in West Africa, and because West Africans are immigrating to the United States today, right? If you don't get this, you miss a lot of important groundwork.
Yes, and I must add, if you read this text, and I didn't put it on here, Dr. Usman Khan's text, the Timbuktu, it's kind of like similar, like Beyond Timbuktu or something.
It is Beyond Timbuktu. Yeah, we had a Beyond series.
Yeah, so he talks about the education in West Africa, the traditional Islamic education in West Africa, and he goes into really deep details. Both books do it, whereas Dr. Ware focuses on the Quran schools, Dr. Khan from Harvard University, he focuses on the universities, like from Timbuktu, I want to say even not just Timbuktu, not just whole Western
South Korea,
right, exactly. Another one of my top favorite books is Servants of the Law by Ceylon Loof. She always also kind of bucks against the Afrocentric.
A little bit. So this book, Servants of the Law, in her introduction, she says something that becomes extremely important. And the rest of the book too, but I want to dwell on the introduction for a second because I said for the first 500 years, you really aren't going to find Muslims, engaging in this religious warfare and slavery that you want to talk about. In the next 500 years, I said there emerges resistance to the slave trade among Muslims, but also collaboration with the slave trade among some, right? So how we parcel that out, right, becomes really important. And her book was the first one that made clear for me what then Bilal Ware's book repeats for him. And that is the dynamic that occurs literally is responsible for the end of a period of political stability and prosperity in West Africa that we call the imperial era. Most people who study West African history learn about Mali, they learn about Ghana, not that order, I'll get it in order. Ghana, Mali, Songhai. These are what we really call the last three maintainers, empires that maintain that period of stability. And the fall of the last one, Songhai, corresponds with two major events. One is the Moroccan invasion of Songhai, but in some ways, more importantly, the end of the Muslim presence in Andalusia, which inaugurates the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, right? Which literally creates a new kind of slavery than we've ever seen on planet Earth. So even when people say, well, it says here that that Ghana traded in gold, and Ghana traded in ivory, and Ghana traded in slaves, and because of the way we teach about slavery in America, people immediately think that means it's the same slavery, right? So what Jufe's book and Bilal Ware's book do is position the reader to understand, A, we're talking about different kinds of slavery. The slavery that starts 500 years ago with the transatlantic slave trade is strictly race-based. Only black people are being enslaved. Or people of African descent, once you get mixing and whatnot going on, right? It is chattel slavery. The enslaved persons are considered nothing but property for the most part. It is Spanish colonies that varies a little bit because the church actually fights for the rights of people in some places. But right, once you get to the Anglo and the German and the Dutch, hey, we're just property here. So it's a very different kind of slavery than the kind of slavery that you had predominating in Africa and Asia, where enslaved people are part of the family. They're not the best part of the family. They're not getting everything good, but they have rights, right? A good bit of what we know about how slavery is supposed to be practiced when we read the Quran, you shouldn't be able to tell the difference between a slave and a master by looking at them. They should be dressed in the same clothes. They should eat the same food. Something much more approaching that, and sometimes actually that is what's happening in much of Africa and Asia. But this new transatlantic thing, that's not what's happening, as we know, right? So Juf lays out how African rulers begin to experience a serious dilemma, because there are few things that you could trade slaves for, but eventually it becomes predominantly guns. And the problem with that is, even if you don't want to participate in the slave trade, if your opponents have guns and you still have swords, spears, and bows and arrows, you're going to be enslaved. So what ensues, what gradually emerges in the Atlantic side of Africa, and to some degree even on the Indian Ocean side of Africa, is an arms race involving, I gotta go get slaves just to protect my people, which opens the door for the corrupt ones who are like, I'm gonna sell some of my people, right? That happened in some cases, right? But it's all a product of this really ugly, evil dynamic brought in by the commercialization of slavery in the Atlantic world. And so understanding that, and then understanding just how many West Africans were enslaved as a result of some of these battles, and transported across the Atlantic Ocean into both North America, South America, and the Caribbean, as really the first large presence of Muslims on this side of the water that's historically uncontested. You could really say 400 solid years, 500 years is, they're gonna find droplets, 400 solid years of Muslims being transported over here. And it's an African story, it's a black story. It's a Muslim story, but Muslims who want to know their history of the Americas have to get to know this black story. So that text really does that work for me. And it ties into Bilal Ware's, because at the same time that, yes, there are some Muslims selling and some Africans selling, there are also some Muslims and some Africans fighting against it. So it's a much more complex picture than a lot of people like it to be.
I may add, it's not on here either, it's Dr. Bernard Freeman from Seton Hall University, possessed by the right hand. Very, very detailed book on, he uses he goes and he uses the Quran to show emancipation, right? But how the Muslim rulers went against that because it wasn't financial benefit to do that. So, in other words, slavery, because of how the Quran mandates it, or emancipation rather,
Yeah, this one.
it would have right, the Sunnah as well, right? There would have the slavery thing could have been done, right? But man does what man does, right?
Say religion is perfect, man is not.
There you go. The book text it goes more, I guess, into more of a modern period, I guess. Muslims in America by Edward Curtis, who spoke here some years ago. I haven't spoke here yet. I think he was on his book,
That was the call of the light.
Call the Loud. Right, exactly. And he has quite a few texts on Muslims in America, particularly Black Muslims in America.
So, as deeply interesting and important, historically contextualizing the 400 years, right, slave trade and immediate post-slave trade years are, most of us are directly impacted by what happened in the 20th century, the 1900s, right? Looking in the room, most of us were probably born in the 20th century. We got a few youngsters who might have been born in the 21st century, but this text is actually useful for learning about the full spectrum of Muslims in America, not just those of African descent, but he does a good job of giving you that broad paintbrush of most of the communities that emerge as Islam reawakens. And I have to say reawakens because the West African Islam that was brought over during the slavery period, slightly after the slavery period, they weren't able to transmit to their children consistently, certainly not to their grandchildren, right? So what has to happen by the turn of the century, by 1900, is Islam has to reawaken among the African descendant peoples of the Americas. And this happens in some ways that many Muslims can recognize as Islamic, and some ways that many Muslims are like, okay, you're calling that Islam, but I don't recognize Islam in that. But all of those pathways give you what we understand Islam to be about in Black America today, largely the marriage between Islam and the Black freedom struggle. The idea that Islam can't be here if it's not about justice, and that justice encompasses to a very large degree the end of racism, the end of anti-Black racism and other forms of racism, but not other forms of racism without dealing with anti-Black racism. So I gave this book because it's the shorter book, but the Call of Bilal by Edward Curtis is a more in-depth book in some ways. And then I left off James Smith's